Welcome everyone, especially the students enrolled in this Coursera class. This is a Harvard USC Calarts adjunct, and I'm Professor Dr. Aaron Sheley, and I'll be teaching film criticism, which is a 405 level. And this semester has about, it looks like according to the calendar that we have about 7 to 6 more hours to discuss movies in this curriculum, and I had to adjust the volume. That's Dead Tellurider's Album 3, The Vagabond Prince, a classy album. Most of it was filmed live in some productions. Now, I do have the chairholdership at USC of the Griffith Chair. It's nothing spectacular. Well, it is because, in a way, it gives me the right to talk about Griffith as an expert. But I was an expert on Griffith a long time ago. That I'm a little rusty isn't true. That I know these stories well is, and that a lot of them are legendary stories, but most of them concerning D.W. Griffith are things of legend anyway. And I was going to go back over The Birth of a Nation and say, like, do critics now think it's racist, but that it wasn't then or was then? And we've gone over it and over it with the race, class, gender studies, which we must study in film. Because not only do they lend us credence to how to figure out why postmodern films are feminist or why they're told from a different perspective from the usual medium of how film is told. But if this is a film that represents the medium and how it's told, then I'm in, because not until Cloud Atlas have I seen anything that even come close to the potential of what this movie really builds up to be. And Intolerance fulfills its potential by having the biggest cast in motion picture history, and this time they may have gotten it more than Cabaret, although Cabaret does have a momentous amount of people moving from one place to the next. I remember this Theo Angelopoulos movie called Traveling Players, and it's like Weeping Meadow is another one of his, and it's like these crowd of people that are like immigrating to another city because they can't get their food supply in their town, and they're just Weeping Meadows, just all of them walking, starving, and needing to get to this other town. And it's like if the cinematographer is that perfect at getting these crowd shots, and that there are crowd shots like it in some of the big gangbuster movies like Heaven's Gate that busted up the studios for crashing so hard at the box office, but that even it was an attempted intolerance. Is true that the last minute rescue does factor into this because that's a D.W. Griffith motif ever since The Adventures of Dolly, where he hired the Humane Society to show him a film dog that could run around and save people on rafts. But in the last minute rescue sequence of this film by D.W. Griffith in 1916, this comes after Birth of a Nation, is meant to be an apology, and all the stories in it are about slavery. And we've talked a little bit about intolerance and how it was the only movie that had extra prints going out to foreign countries. And Eisenstein, Podovkin, Kuleshov, Dovchenko, all those guys were editing copies of Intolerance, putting it back in order, putting the four stories together, making it four movies, trying every assemblage different that they could, and never quite reaching the limit to how many times they could recut it and make it a different movie with different outcome. But in the Griffith version, that it's climax after climax and conflict resolution a little bit until the climaxes again, all in the name of like breaking free from slavery in Babylon, breaking free from slavery by following Jesus our Lord. The St. Valentine's Day French Revolution stuff is the French and the English no longer want to put each other in monarchy, slavery. And then the final story, which is a modern day tale in the 1916, you got to imagine, because it seems like a 1920 story, and it's Lillian Gish and her husband are too poor to stay together because her husband has to go find work somewhere else. But leaving the woman alone at home with a baby she just had, that her husband had impregnated her and been gone so long she had a baby, and that suddenly these irresponsible women that Griffith reviled in other short films of his came by and took the baby because the baby wasn't being fed properly, and therefore the mother's in malfeasance. And when she goes to jail, the guy gets in the way and says, you can't take her to jail. And so now they're taking him to the gallows. And in a chase from the governor's office back to the hanging noose, where the hanging noose is just a lynch mob away, the governor and his vehicle come speeding down the train tracks in a reverse French Connection car chase, where the governor gets there right before they pull the hanging switch. And the only thing in this movie that doesn't sum up as intolerance is that the guy is saved. That he was ever up for the death penalty for defending his wife because they were going to lose their baby never really gets resolved. But that he doesn't get hanged for it, I guess we're supposed to show some sympathy. But in the Babylon sequence, there's something interesting about this film that cuts back and forth between four stories that are told of four different things, not like Rashomon, which cuts four stories and is told of the same event, but in different ways. This does have some repeat events from close-up points of view, but not really, and the depth of focus is so big on Billy Bitzer's overcoming the dolly shot that starts from the bottom of the shot at the Whore of Babylon and comes up wide to reveal a Babylon set so amazing that they use it in D.W. Griffith's honor at the Kodak Theater, where they have elephants propped everywhere, and it's a Babylon set. That everyone's walking like an Egyptian, that there's a cast of thousands in the shot, that it's everybody's favorite shot to analyze on how a wide shot can change the meaning of a close-up to a wide shot. And that is such a big, notorious boom shot that cost a lot of the movie's money making was in building the sets, and that sometimes you can go to the sets of cinema studios and still see Griffith's intolerant sets is true. That the French Revolution is similar to how it is in Orphans of the Storm, but this is mostly to symbolize the reduction of slavery. Now, that he's not talking about African American slavery anymore is because he pretty much banned himself from the topic of African Americans after Birth of a Nation backfired and the Klan got into it and everything got ruined by the nature of how it was supposed to be a spawn of African American cinema, which really we haven't even seen, although the Hughes brothers did do Book of Eli, and that was a pretty big blockbuster. But the rise of the black filmmaker since Oscar Micheaux all the way to the period of Spike Lee leaves us wondering why Shadows by John Cassavetes is not a blaxploitation film, but a crossover film that works. Is like really all we have of like this piecemeal history. And then we have the whole blaxploitation movement of the 70s, which we can just revel at and engage in critical contact with all we want, whether there are codes in it that aren't codified for all of us. It doesn't matter. We can get out of it the arts and entertainment that we need. And Intolerance edits the film in such a way that it's like this train going by the whole event. And it's like the governor has to race through Babylon. He has to race through Jesus' time. He has to race through the St. Valentine's Massacre. And he has to race the train on the tracks to stop the guy from being hung. It's going to make us lose all hope in humanity, which we're already doing. Because when Babylon fell, everybody killed each other, Judith of Bethulia style. When the St. Valentine's Day Massacre triggered the French Revolution, everybody be getting shot and whacked and stabbed. And like I like how the Queen is wearing like her Queen of Hearts attire so she can be an Alice in Wonderland character. And the Jesus scenes are so short and sweet that you're just like, well, we all had to know that Griffith wanted to make a Jesus movie, but that it's only 4 or 5 shots of things that aren't even in Jesus in it. Most of it's intertitles, Bible verses that apply to the nature of the theme, which that the title Intolerance is the theme of intolerance is intolerance. And that it tests your tolerance towards watching movies because it's 4 hours long. And that it's 4 different stories told in about 5 minutes, 6-minute takes for 4 hours does mean that you could collect an hour of each film and make 4 direct features out of it. But it was never intended that way. It was always intended to switch between the stories to see if that experimented, thus teaching the Soviets montage, who taught it back to us, and then Sam Peckinpah pulled it off the best. But I think that Griffith deserves a nod for, once again, collision with capitalism. Let's spend as much possible money as we have on it. Money that we don't have that's going downhill in the lawsuits against Birth of a Nation. And we're going to raise money from Hollywood, and we're going to sue Edison for more money, and we're going to we're going to mortgage our houses. We're going to do everything for a bigger budget than Birth of a Nation, which did make a lot of money, but to cover its cost, I'm not sure if those receipts are even in now that these Kino video editions exist. And we saw my Birth of a Nation copy was a Kino Blu-ray. These Kino versions of Griffith are really treasured. And the only one that I'm going to be covering today that isn't on Kino is Way Down East, which I have a copy of on, it looks like, Black Hawk Films, which looks like it may have been really hard to get a hold of the copy of Way Down East I have, and we'll look at that box in a minute. But that Intolerance is 4 hours is a test of endurance that rewards you with the lead character not dying. That he was ever on the hangman's noose, you forget that it was total injustice because he's set free. And we're also relieved that Griffith didn't kill us by the end of the movie and send himself to our own time with an army of Klansmen to kill us all for being slave owners is a miracle, because every flinching moment of this disaster action film has action, love, passion, deceit, murder, betrayal, all the things of all 4 parts. And Christ's death paid for it all, but it's not enough, because now we're in the modern era and the governor is the only one that can stop us from being hung. Even though he just barely heard the news that an innocent man was to be hung, he didn't read the trial, was on his way to stop it. And that extended time in a French Connection kind of parallel cut takes place, where the car's coming up the ramp, chasing the train back and forth, and like almost a Keystone Cops final chase, What he's getting the governor, and you don't see the people in the car. Car's coming fast, and all of a sudden, they flip the switch. Before they flip the switch, the guy's not hung, and the movie pretty much ends with him kissing her husband, and he's kind of lifting his noose off, and he's saying something like, "No noose is good news." No, I'm just kidding. He doesn't say that. And besides, who'd want to bring up Blazing Saddles at a time like this? I'm so offended that I used a Blazing Saddles comment seriously in a Birth of a Nation comment, because those two movies, mixing them together, is a vile, repugnant thought. but, that it would have been like a scene from Intolerance is true, that everything goes chaotically wrong is true, that they threw money at a disaster train wreck is true, that everything goes apeshit like the last days of Pompeii is absolutely what this frenetic movie is about. It's like the end of Metropolis, where the flooding city attracts everyone to help out the situation. But in Intolerance, no one's helping, and all against all in Babylon, all against all in French and England. Christ is crucified just like usual, made to carry his cross, and now our friend is saved. And how they do that in 4 hours is because they keep cutting between the stories and keep us jumping back and forth. And now we're getting smarter from watching images, because we've got to keep track of all 4 stories as they're unfolding across this length. I did mention Cloud Atlas had about 8 to 16 stories in it that are all crossovers with each other in a common way of clipping in and out of at least 3 stories at the same time, and then going for the next 3 while juggling in the previous one and juggling in the next one. And Cloud Atlas kind of does that in a super frenetic cutting way that is still mathematical, is coded, is logged as the way they wanted to cut it. And in a way, it's a more extreme pattern of cutting than Intolerance. Why Intolerance works better is because the segments are cut according to how long they should go, even in accordance with the correct clips of the other story, so that it flows well. You have a certain time code that you build a shot and a scene, and the scene lasts 5 minutes, and then it turns into 2 scenes, which are sequences. But that the sequence in Babylon, the sequence in France and England, the sequence with Christ on the cross, and the sequence in 1916, pre-Jazz Age era, are all built on each other, flowing together. That's why the Christ story doesn't come out often. It's like, when Christ needs to be unleashed in this picture, we will. But for now, we're skipping between Babylon and the modern day story, because those two relate. And that it switches back and forth between the stories, not in a row every time, is something that we need to realize about why Intolerance might have been harder than Cloud Atlas to edit. Because it's not always the scene, it's the subsequent scene from the Babylon set you see in the next Babylon set. But since there's a Christ scene and a French scene sometimes in between it, the Babylon set won't come till later. That it can go from any pattern, from Christ to Babylon to Valentine to Christ to Babylon, back to the modern day, back to Babylon, back to modern day, is something that the film does quite variably often to maintain the cut of each shot is symmetrical with the previous one and either lengthens it by just the standard amount, which is like by a minute of second time, which takes off 30 seconds. So 30 seconds more on some shots will flow together. And if it's a crazy bombastic shot, you're going to have to go shot within shot to build the montages within the single events of these flash forwarding and flashbacking stories. And that you're building the clips in your own mind while you're watching this film is no accident. That's making you learn how to edit is different than Birth of a Nation, which is showing you how to film with a camera any event that you want to and make it look a certain way. And I didn't mean to bring that repugnant movie back into it. No, I'm kidding. But Intolerance does make sense why it's on the AFI new list, because we have a film we've covered before in this class where we've talked about intolerance, and you can even see the elephants up there on the ledge that are in Hollywood now. But that, it was reckless cinema for the sake of cinema, bankrolled by Griffith and totally flopped, and everyone hated it and wanted him to re-release Birth of a Nation. Was a rumor, and around this time, Oscar Micheaux actually admitted that Griffith was right, that Birth of a Nation was racist, and he wanted to direct the movie that would make up for it Within Our Gates, which we already talked about. But now we must move along, because we've been on the subject of intolerance for a while, and now we've got to spend it on 3 more Griffith movies, and this is what it's like to be the Griffith chair. He made about 50 feature films, apart from the 500 short films he made. I've seen 100 of the existing short films, which are all the existing short films, and all the other films from Avenger or Judith of Bethulia to The Struggle, a sound film, early in the sound era. I've seen all of those, and there's a couple parts I'm having trouble with on the Love Flower, remembering how it differentiates from some of the other ones. And that we're covering the ones I own, except for True Heart Susie, we're going to have to cover at some point in this class. And The Greatest Question, Birth of a Nation, should have been left off limits, except that they show you how to make a movie, and that they show you stereotypes within that. And there should never be blackface, except in Spike Lee's Bamboozled. And you know why? Because it's Spike Lee, and he can do what the fuck he wants. And if he wants to make one of his blackface actors black to comment on racism with blackface, I'm in, bro, because you're Spike Lee, and you can do what the fuck you want. Now, this is Broken Blossoms, which is Griffith saying, fuck you, I'm doing what the fuck I want. And he's saying it in a way that's saying, this time I'm not going to be racist, like some of the metaphors of intolerance are taken to mean, that these civilizations of colonial power will industrialize. Is intolerance's main metaphor about how there's a collapse of society, about spending money and overspending money on lavish things, and then watching it all collapse, because nothing lasts forever. Broken Blossoms switches gear into a Docks of New York scenography that makes a Japanese man that lives there as a Buddhist priest meet a young girl who's Irish, and her dad's an Irish drunken boxer who is racist, and he does not want her marrying a Japanese man, which he catches them together, goes ballistic, does a couple of cool boxing matches, which, by the way, this is filmed by the Billy Bitzer crew again, and you have these expressionistic sets, but that they're more minimal than the sets of Birth of a Nation and Intolerance is without saying. That it's 1919, and we're already past Hearts of the World, and Hearts of the World could end up being Griffith's best movie, and it's a World War I film about how Griffith went to World War I and fought with all these different people to end the war in Europe, and how the Inglorious Bastards were in that as the Jews from Griffith's Hollywood past, and his Hollywood present is no accident. But that Broken Blossoms does feature all this iconography of the Japanese guy in it, and how he's like a samurai ninja. I don't know, but he is a faith healer, and he can usually heal. Lillian Gish, who plays the romantic lead in this, is gone through the gauntlet again in terms of her feminism, whereas everybody's now going to see the movie because Lillian Gish is in it. That it's directed by Griffith and Lillian Gish is a draw to some. But mostly to see Lillian Gish kicked around, nobody wants to. They want it to be like Test of the Storm Country, where you do go through a lot of troubles, but it's so melodramatic that you're like taken aback as an audience that this was drama, that it was staged drama, and that Broken Blossoms is like some kind of documentary realism is true, because the deep focus and the wider takes and the less montage and the linear storyline, even more linear than Birth of a Nation, is Broken Blossoms. And then when it comes down to the scene where the drunken Irish boxer comes in to kill his daughter and the Japanese guy for getting together at all, is a shot by shot remade in the movie The Shining, where Jack Nicholson comes axing through the door and the shots are filmed the same way. Kubrick filmed it like Broken Blossoms and edited it like Broken Blossoms unintentionally. Broken Blossoms is a real interesting film. It took me a long time to track it down. I kept getting glitched out copies, but I got to give it to Kino. They do a nice job on these Griffith movies and with bonus footage, and for restoring these silent films for these films surviving, that all of the Griffith films do survive from after his days with the early vaudeville and Tin Pan Alley, and that his movies survived even from then in biograph form. And the biograph shorts are a Kino video collection, and that they've got even Hearts of the World somewhere available on disc, but I can't find it, is true. That I did rent it from Netflix once is also true. And that I have seen Hearts of the World on YouTube, where all the Griffith films are, even his surviving short films, is a necessary factor to becoming a Griffith fan. Well, restate that all of Griffith's films are pretty close to being a masterpiece. Several are, except for Birth of a Nation and The Greatest Question, which are almost masterpieces in their own right by teaching how to make cinema, but totally fall out of proportion from being a masterpiece. And then R.W. Fassbinder's Fox and His Friends makes more sense than Griffith's portrayal of The Greatest Question, where the race is questioned in a race card way, and that we all know Birth of a Nation was and still is the Klansman's monograph on why they should assemble, and still assemble because the South still needs our protection, but is no longer the left wing. It's now the right wing become the racists, and that's a whole story for Malcolm X to tell. But by the way, before I go on with Griffith, I just want to say about Spike Lee, he did a great job with the movie Malcolm X, and it's totally underrated. Like the Denzel plays Malcolm X is already wild and crazy, but the fact that Spike Lee's in it as his friend and made an optical illusion to look shorter than Denzel, which he only is by a little bit, and that everything about the movie Malcolm X makes so much sense in the context of multicultural history, and that, like, there are things in it that only African American audiences can respond to in a way that makes sense. It doesn't make sense to me as a movie could have been made like that. In this whole lifetime of movies, we're not going through very many African American films, and it's like, what do we rely on? Mace Windu and Star Wars? I mean, what do we have other than these great other examples? And Malcolm X does a great job. Everything from where Malcolm X becomes Islamic and travels to the Middle East, to where Malcolm X is being set up by cops for his demise, to where his own people are thinking they've got to take violence against him. For him being less violent than Martin Luther King is something that they always mix up history with in my culture, where, like, they'll say Malcolm X was like this Machiavellian violence is an answer type guy. And really, the movie shows him, once he's committed to Islam, that he's peaceful, and this whole notion of a jihad is his inner demons. And that Malcolm X was a Mohammedan and did believe his inner demons personified some of his followers, and they'd have to take him out for not following the ways of Muhammad completely all the way through, is totally amazing, because not many movies talk about the Quran in the sense that it is, like New Testament and Old Testament scripture, a holy book of God written by God about how we respond to God's heavenly promise of an afterlife with wives and husbands and kids and pleasure gardens, instead of the pain and toil we go through in this life. And that the Quran offers hope that all multicultural will work out, and that he who is on one side and he who is on the other side will join together and be this kind of utopia. And that's been a question of why people love the Quran. And I think that Malcolm X, after Birth of a Nation being 100 years before or whatever, that Spike Lee does such a good job, that it's undeniable that Spike Lee is one of the finest African American filmmakers that ever lived, and that there are only about 5 I can really name, and one of them's an African, is to my own resort an underexplored area. That Melvin Van Peebles for the blaxploitation era did a lot is important too. Now that we get a race card in this film, that the Irish drunken boxer doesn't want his daughter miscegenating with the Japanese guy. We're talking about racism coming up in stereotypes with the Japanese guy, but it's so realistic that you're like okay with it. And that Lillian Gish really does play this poor, beautiful lover girl, and it's like becoming a Romeo and Juliet story, which they both do die of heartbreak, fear, and anger, and they've been beaten within an inch of their life, and that they pretty much die in each other's arms, although Buddha may revive the Japanese guy in this movie, and he very well might. But the everything from the gong banging at the beginning, which Intolerance has an interesting gong banging similar to Broken Blossoms, that it was an expensive movie to recreate the Japanese section of the docks of New York is true, that the Irish boxer goes to some big boxing matches is big, and that it's kind of a melodrama in the sense of a domestic melodrama, just with the racist card looked at especially familiarly by Griffith in a way just totally less problematic than the Champion's Greatest Question and Birth of a Nation. That we've all been talking about Griffith's flaw for so long in Griffith's studies of making two crappy movies and the rest perfect is our flaw, because we always remember the bad ones that went wrong, were disasters, and we still kind of slyly liked them for somehow making a cultural statement in a time where the world was devoid of cultural statements. And Broken Blossoms coming out right around the time that women are given the vote in America is proof of this. And that Lillian Gish and all these actresses like Mae Marsh and these actresses like Mary Pickford were pushing for the women's vote, and were movie stars pushing for it, that were equalizing women with the real world, was just coming about, and that women would be objectified and imprisoned by the camera image, but that they had power within it to bring about the vote and bring about women filmmakers and writers. That we had to say Birth of a Nation probably crippled some of what would otherwise be some of the greatest African American movies, even after giving the show his chance. But that we just discussed Broken Blossoms, and it kind of shows what's broken about the whole situation of racism, and it kind of makes me look back and say, well, maybe Birth of a Nation wasn't just intended for Klan audiences, and maybe we should be a lot less offended at Birth of a Nation for showing things that we are uncomfortable with, but that in certain circumstantial evidence could be true. But Birth of a Nation makes that fatal plot point error and shows that the North, who have actually banned from their legislature any need for the Klan, and that the North would have arrested the Klan on the spot, coming down from the North to the South to make reparations, that the Klan was not out to save the North, but rather to get the plantations working again with the slaves back in the slave field. And I think that's a point we all miss about the Civil War, is after the Civil War, the Klan was trying to re-enslave the blacks. Whether they did or not is a story that no one's told in cinema. Not even Mississippi Burning covers that story. But that the Japanese guy dies of a broken heart, and Lillian Gish dies of a broken heart, is already amazing. It's this whole Daphnis and Chloe Western culture of we're going to die in our grave because we were about to make love, and then we were killed by the racist guy, who is your drunken dad. And daddy swills down alcohol at a rate faster than we're going to see in the alcoholic movie. The struggle is something to Broken Blossoms' total glory. Now, before we get to the last one, there's another Griffith film, and we're maintaining that Griffith chair, and we're going to talk about Griffith on this channel, and we're going to try not to offend anyone by talking about Griffith and how all of his other movies are pretty much a masterpiece, and that Birth of a Nation, that we all like it the most, is the worst one, and Greatest Question is second worst one, and all the rest are fucking pretty good. And Way Down East is an interesting movie because we talked about it a little bit. Lillian Gish plays the character that is in a family of a lot of people, and a really bad guy comes and, like, basically, I have to be blunt, it doesn't show it, but this guy rapes her, gets her pregnant, and forces her to marry him so that he can cheat while she has the baby. And then when she has the baby, he wants to lend it out to adoption and then rape her again. And that's how stark this Lillian Gish conquest is. And that the end of the movie has her nearly getting killed by being ostracized from her family, and that she's fallen on a frozen river full of icebergs that are splitting in half, and she's about to go over a waterfall, and this isn't our hospitality, it's actually before it. And that Lillian Gish did some of her own stunts is amazing. But that she's shown as overly oppressed and we feel bad for her is a relief to the oppression, like you get in Broken Blossoms. And Intolerance has less of relief for oppression, but Way Down East does have enough Hollywood in it to resist totally oppressing this one girl who's trying to take the movie. And now she's in a family that thinks she is leaving her husband to be with another guy, but doesn't know her husband's been cheating on her and waiting to rape her again after she has his baby, which was she's gonna love anyway. And we forget that at the end of the film that she's gonna raise a kid that's partially she was made victim to raise, but she's gonna raise it with this guy who's in the family who loves her even more, although he thinks she jinxed everyone by cheating with him too, and that she should take care of her husband, who's off cavorting, and then turning around and framing Lillian Gish for getting pregnant with another guy. Although they already pretty much knew she was pregnant from the original guy. And then she goes sinking over ice cubes on a waterfall, and they save her at the last minute. It's kind of a bittersweet victory like you get from Intolerance, and not from the tragic ending of Broken Blossoms, because that they maintain hope and become a family again and practically have Thanksgiving right when they rescue her from the snow. And they just figured out, when there's a last minute rescue, they just figured out that her character was innocent the whole time, and they don't even like eat crow about it. They're like, well, sorry we almost mobbed you and killed you and left with that rapist serial killer, but you're still family, right? Come on, we're way down east. We're not down south. We're down east. That means we're like at the Mason-Dixon line, right? And we can treat our women however wrong we want, and that Griffith is speaking up against this is noteworthy of his social constructs in a media that's supposedly devoid of social iconography of the things that deal with critiques on society. And the critiques on society deal with the things we need to study when it comes from film, and that's why we do the race, class, and gender. Now I'm getting ready to wrap up. This has been kind of a short lecture, and I don't have a lot more to say about Griffith quite yet, although True Heart Susie is on my Griffith playlist a couple of times on my silent film page on YouTube. And if you haven't seen True Heart Susie, and if you can track down Hearts of the World, those I'm wholeheartedly recommending as the masterpieces of Griffith's time. But Orphans of the Storm is another masterpiece, less and another gauntlet for Lillian Gish, and this time her sister Dorothy Gish, to face. That's in the middle of the Revolutionary War. Kind of reminds us of that scene that scenography from Intolerance that takes place in the same kind of Renaissance, Victorian, Restoration kind of period. And then Orphans of the Storm is basically the plot of Les Miserables. Doesn't even begin to explain that Les Miserables owes to Orphans of the Storm basically its whole story, although it was written by Victor Hugo long before Orphans of the Storm. And it's Griffith, again, adapting from great novels, like he always does in his all original scripts. And that he did pretty much write the original scripts for Broken Blossoms and Way Down East and Intolerance. Broken Blossoms and Way Down East were also books around the same time, if not before or after they were movies. And they kind of had those agreements. And Orphans of the Storm, although I'm not sure it's in book form, is in fact the conquest of the Revolutionary War that we see in other movies. That the guillotine isn't totally expressed in Orphans of the Storm, but that war erupts all around the city and goes on for the duration of the movie is true, and that the Lillian Gish and Dorothy Gish are oppressed and in hiding, and that Dorothy Gish is blind in the movie, and her sister Lillian has to take care of a blind girl living homeless with some barbaric pimps and whatnot. that are all going up against the backdrop of this war that's erupted and is killing everybody. Then it has a last minute rescue, and one thing I'll say is the happy ending and the amount of conflict resolution and left over from the end of the films of these last minute rescues is relief that something bad or terrible didn't happen. But then do we suddenly forget that something so bad and terrible just happened 5 minutes ago for the duration of since the beginning of the film till then? And these tacked on happy endings are like, whew, we barely made it. We barely destroyed the Death Star. We barely got out of there and we're fine. But like Star Wars are putting the medals on. But Griffith's got no hat grabber. He's just saying, well, they're all safe, the end. For now, anyway, the end. Until next time, the end. And that Griffith's building this cinema, total, the myth of absolute total cinema, or the myth of total cinema by Andrea Bazin is being built in these classical ways, all the way up to Orphans of the Storm, which we take these four movies, Intolerance, Broken Blossoms, Way Down East, and Orphans of the Storm, and relegate them as the Griffith study guides to why he actually does make really great symmetrical Renaissance painting movies, which is where you split down the middle and you can see a reverse or exacting image on each side of the symmetry. That we use rule of thirds for where we set her up, and we can see even on this cover, if we make the rule of thirds, their heads are appearing right around the range of where the intersections are in the square on the third tic-tac-toe grid, right? You see her face up here and her face down here within the rule of thirds. That these movies totally set an edge for actresses in the future that would be famous, as Lillian Gish was more famous than D.W. Griffith all throughout her career, but that he made her famous. And that she's in a Robert Altman movie called The Wedding is pretty cool, because she was pretty old when she was in the 70s in The Wedding, and she still had this classy style about her, even in a sound film where she was known mostly for her silent work. And that the silent actors and actresses didn't make the sound cut isn't really a Singing in the Rain thing where they had the voice like that. It was that A, they didn't want to make anything other than silent films. B, they were trained for silent films. And C, those sound film did sound pretty good and expensive and worth them investing in, and they did invest in sound film. A lot of them could just never really get a project that would have worked as a sound film, while their voices were the least of their worries, because when Garbo was first synced, they didn't know if it would work in a sound film, and by the time you get to Ninotchka, Garbo's voice is one of the mythologies of early Hollywood cinema. And as we leave today and study one more film one more time, we'll take a look at Birth of a Nation and the final say we made last time. So all we can say is that we're glad the techniques didn't go to waste just in this bad film, because those other films we mentioned today, again, Intolerance, Broken Blossoms, Way Down East, and Orphans of the Storm, which we kind of cut short what we said about Orphans of the Storm, because I want you to see it for kind of like this Barry Lyndon masterpiece, where everybody's in this costume drama, where everybody's doing Les Miserables, where everybody wants the French underground to win, and wants this blind girl to get healed, and wants the sisters to escape, and through near torture and torment every day from the war and their homeless guides, which is a throwback to the movie Greed, which is, by the way, coming around at the same time. And Greed is that movie that we need to discuss by Eric von Stroheim, who's making like a Griffith film, but it's 8 hours long, his original cut. And that the studio cut it down to 2 hours means the studio cut 6 hours out of it. But when the studio cuts out of scenes that the contract says they can take as much as they want out, and they don't have to restore the footage. They can actually deposit it into the trash. And that's why 6 hours of Greed was lost, and they say it's the holy grail of cinema. If anyone has it in a closet somewhere, any footage of Greed, turn it in. The TCM took the photo stills of the movie and put them back in with music next to the actual moving sequences from the 2 hour version of Greed, and assembled a 4 hour version is a fucking miracle. And I think TCM deserves a round of applause fucking doing that, because we're talking Greed is back and it's 4 hours long. And if I find the rest of Magnificent Ambersons at UCLA, we're going in. But Birth of a Nation is the reason all of Griffith's movies are still restored and are restored to the maximum. And that is because it later made so much money, but mostly in an academic arena where we could test whether it's still racist, and it will stay still racist, but that they tested it at all, and it turned out to be the same stereotypes they could have avoided in 1915 because Fouillard's making films with no stereotypes in France. And suddenly Griffith comes on the scene. After Judith of Bethulia rocks, after Avenging Conscience rocks, he sinks his whole ship on the monumental Capital for the Sake of Capital movie, and then comes back around with the Capitalist for the Sake of Capitalist movie, Intolerance, that we're going to let the AFI go with as being a number one movie. And that it's a number one movie for Griffith doesn't explain how Orphans of the Storm and Broken Blossoms tie for first place too. And that their tag-along Birth of a Nation is like their annoying friend that won't stop talking about the Civil War and is only lost in Civil War metaphors, means that Griffith's got other wars to go to, and he's got other things he's got to talk about, and other things to explore, and that he's capital for the sake of capital just means he's throwing money at it, whether it makes money or not, as a cinema grotesque kind of expressionistic do it big, do it the bigger, the more they'll know we spent money on it. And you can kind of see that the directors are throwing money and throwing movie stars at these things like Hollywood should, just for the sake of not only making money, but having it in the first place to throw around to make these reckless movies. And for that, I gotta say, that's the whole reason I became the Griffith chair, because most of his movies aren't that bad. You consider a director like Kubrick, and a lot of his films are a lot more problematic than Griffith's only two problematic films out of a sack end of 555 other films. And though A Slave in His Trust and Proud Kentuckian are problematic, they're definitely not on the degrading towards the African American level of Birth of a Nation. So beware when watching Birth of a Nation that you might get a little mixed up on what kind of ideology Griffith's father's oratorio on the Klansmen really made an impact on Griffith's mind about the romantic era of the Civil War and how that romance plays out in a romantic couple with Lillian Gish and her co-stars and everything in Birth of a Nation. But that they wrecked everything on their intolerance project and threw more money at it than Birth of a Nation that they didn't have, and it flopped, wasn't a bad thing, like when Heaven's Gate flopped, because Griffith said, see, I can spend all my money on it and waste it on it, and that's what this movie's about, is wasting money on a movie. And if you're going to waste money on a movie, man, I'm in, dude, because I've been working on broke sets all the time, and we somehow, just by directing a film, it causes money to appear, and like it's weird, and you get these things and these trades, and you can make these big films even as an independent director. But I've had a couple of projects that if people would have watched would have been like, that was expensive to make, wasn't it? And I'm like, well, it cost me my life savings. I had to trade my car in for it. The only car director without a car, because a long time ago, to make a Denver movie, I traded in my last car on making the movie, and we've banked it all, and it's a big waste of money for the sake of cinema. But it's the sake of cinema that we can, for the sake of wasting money. Now, for the sake of wasting money is what makes it look big and crazy, and that all the money it's got to end up on the screen is true with Griffith, because down to the last 16,000 horses that he has, he's still keeping track of it in this big record book that he doesn't have on Birth of a Nation because his script kept getting destroyed. And so here he comes onto the set of Birth of a Nation with a 350-page script in his head, and he's got it totally memorized, and he's shooting it all out of sequence. Now that we know, probably Troma's book on how to shoot a movie is probably the closest truth to even how Griffith did it, because when you're shooting a movie, you want to shoot all of your exteriors, that is your outdoor shots, and the script marks whether it's exterior or interior, then lists the setting, then the time of day, whether it's night or day. Now, if you had an exterior at all, you're going to know you got to line up all your exteriors in the priority they need shot, which is how difficult the shot is to how easy the shot is, and you do the easy ones later, but still the outdoor ones all first. That way you get your exterior shots, and you don't have to wait till roiling weather coming through and be stuck not getting the exterior shots Well, the interior shots you can get second, and since they're a stable indoor set, you can manipulate the set however you want it to look, which is in the outside world. There are some sets that build outside, but if you look at Greed, the movie, they're in the Mojave Desert for real, and it looks like he's handcuffed to his. They're both handcuffed to each other, dying, and there's a dead horse that they're handcuffed to too, and there's no moving for this McTeague who's gone from coal mining gold to being a golden dentist, all the way to this moment where he's trapped, stuck to a horse, stuck to a guy who's already dead that he shot, and he's dying in the desert, and that's on location. But these shots that Griffith has, that are manipulated sets indoors, might have been shot secondly and do still have to add up mathematically between the frame rate and some kind of a ratio of how the film is cutting together from the interiors to the exteriors. And in a movie like Birth of a Nation, being a war film, most of it's exterior. The whole battle sequence is exterior, and the battle sequence, we think, may be the best of all the war sequences in any movie, even better than the Paths of Glory debacle or anything like that. And that Birth of a Nation does have a great war scene, and that they did shoot the exteriors first to make it easier is kind of where Troma's coming from. Because then you shoot the interior and you don't have to worry about weather. You can get the rehearsals done, you can get the acting done, and you don't have to worry about where the sun is, and you can use artificial light. And there's all these advantages you have on the interior, but you still divide the shots up by most complicated interior to last. Now, if there's a love scene at all, skip all those rules and film it first, because actors that say they'll do a love scene, you need to get their love scene out of the way, because later they might chicken out and say, well, maybe I didn't want to do a love scene after all. It would be kind of awkward. So directors are like, get the love scene, make them sign the contract that they're going to do the movie, and film your exteriors, and maybe the love scene's an exterior, or in Broken Blossoms, much an interior. What it was an interior. So shoot your exteriors, use a rule of thirds, use symmetry, whatever you got to do. If you got a tree on one frame, balance it with a rock on the other side on the lower third. But when you're using indoor cuts, you can do a lot more of the 180-degree shot, reverse shot, match on action, classical Hollywood lighting that Griffith is so profound to have invented in those 5 films we looked at today. In those 5 films we looked, those 4 films, but 5 counting Birth of a Nation, are the ones I own by Griffith. And you're thinking, don't you own the rest? And I do, but it's on my YouTube account, and I've downloaded all of them, and I'm saving all of them in a playlist archive, and that there's a silent film site that has available some of these films, even perhaps Hearts of the World, if it reappears on the list, because some of those YouTube lists are manufactured to kind of repeat. And so I just got a page from the Iranian film consulate. He wants to get a hold of me, so I better go talk to him. But I just wanted to leave you all with, D.W. Griffith truly is the master of cinema. He invented film language before anyone else did, that's most commonly used in directing today. That his directing style is even common among Troma, for how the difficult to easy shots are set up first in exteriors, then in interiors, unless there's an interior that's really complex that they need to shoot first, and then they shoot it first. The budget all going, of course, to the actual things that are in the movie, and the props and the cast and the editing. Everything the budget is all the movie costs to make. Hang on a second, I'm almost done. I'll meet you out in the kitchen. Okay, cool. So before I go, you have these contexts of these visual storytelling, that all these items are out arrayed before you for the budget of the film, and that Griffith's no holds barred about his budget shows that he's not that compromising. He's like Kubrick. He's like, we've had a couple of good ones, make some good budgets. Let's get really reckless and spend and waste money on some kind of like wild blaster sequence. Means they're not wasting money. They're having this theatrical kind of thing that you can't do with any other medium, that you can't do the shot intolerance as a dolly track zoom out over a huge crowd of Egyptian walking Babylonians that are about to kick the shit out of each other and fight over some prostitute that's being shot by an arrow. And then he captures the chaos and madness in such a perfect, DJ Spooky even says, meticulous and intentional way. Makes us kind of veer away from why we only think about Birth of a Nation as his only film, when none of the rest of his films were bad, besides The Greatest Question and Birth of a Nation. And yet we can't give him credit anymore for being the world's greatest director, even though he made more masterpieces than any other director ever in any country. But because Birth of a Nation left him scarred at the end of his life, even after legalizing weed for Louis Armstrong in the military, it makes me realize that all the blacklists said him and he would have rather gone to war, and he wasn't complaining about going to war and being a commander as an air pilot. But it's kind of sad that we all sit here, even me, and we're just going along with how we could somehow re-edit Birth of a Nation to work. It doesn't work that way. You take one scene out, the whole movie is like a stack of dominoes. It falls apart. So we just move on and say, well, I hope to God somebody sees one of these other Griffith films first and not Birth of a Nation first. And if they are into Birth of a Nation, they better be Civil War buffs, because there's no reason to really get into that movie except for history buffs of how cinema is made and history buffs of Civil War representations in 1915 would be an application for that. But that I can recommend Intolerance, Broken Blossoms, Way Down East, and Orphans of the Storm to anyone and everyone, and can prove they're better movies in a row that all directors could make, Kubrick or Hitchcock too, and that we all say, well, since Griffith went down feeling guilty about being a racist, suddenly we've got to take him down from being the best director of all time, even though 553 of his films were fucking masterpieces. So I'll be the Griffith chairholder, and I'll be going now because I got to smoke pot just to get over this whole Civil War post-traumatic stress disorder I'm having from Birth of a Nation. No, I'm kidding. All right, we'll talk later.